Welcome to Rev Up Your Leadership with Hilda Gann, the podcast for forward thinking, proactive leaders who believe in a people centric approach to business. Whether you're an executive, a seasoned manager, business owner, or a novice manager, this show is for those who know that putting people first drives real, lasting success. Each episode, I sit down with passionate guests, leaders who share real-world experiences, proven frameworks, and insights from their industries. Together, we explore what it takes to lead with impact, stay ahead of the curve, and build thriving, future-ready organizations. If you're ready to lead with purpose, inspire your team, and think strategically, it's time to rev up your leadership and rev up your success. Welcome to another episode of Rev Up Your Leadership. We're going to talk about shared language isn't shared meaning, why leaders must learn cultural fluency. This week, my guest is John Edward McGraw. He is a multicultural work expert, inclusive communication specialist, and a human connection speaker. He's the founder of Hiyaku Coaching, an intercultural communication consultancy. Named for the Japanese word hiyaku, meaning leap forward. He'll tell you more about that later. John helps organizations and leaders navigate cultural divides, integrate international talent, and foster multicultural workplaces where inclusive performances thrive. John built his expertise during 15 years teaching English in Japan and Canada, where he discovered that language training alone can't bridge cultural divides. He holds an ICF credential in coaching and has partnered with JVS Toronto, Workplace and Immigrant Network in Waterloo, and the Simcoe County Department of Economic Development. The purpose? To strengthen cultural fluency and boost retention. His methods empower leaders and international professionals to collaborate effectively, break down barriers, and accelerate shared success. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Hilda. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to be on the show.
When we first talked and learned a little bit about each other, I thought, wow, there is this there's this cultural aspect that people don't think about. And we think we have good intentions, but if we don't understand different culture nuances, we actually may be disrespectful when we think we are respectful. So I know we want to talk about a bunch of different things, and the title is that first point. You said shared language isn't shared meaning. Tell us more about what that means.
Shared language isn't shared meaning. Ties back to an experience I had when I was teaching English in Japan. And there was one particular incident that happened one day that drove that point home for me. In 2005, I was teaching English at a school that catered towards adults learning English, particularly those who wanted to develop their English abilities so that they could get good scores on English tests, officially recognized English tests. And getting good scores there could open up job opportunities in their workplaces and so on and so forth. One of my students was named Kenji. He was a middle-aged businessman. He was very determined to take advantage of this and get opportunities in his career. One day, we had a lesson that was focusing on multiple choice question strategy. Very simple concept. If you don't know the answer, when in doubt, choose C. Seems very basic. It seems like something that we learn as school children. I certainly learned that back in elementary school. But it was something that, interestingly enough, many adults in Japan would struggle with at times. The reason being because there is a real aversion to risk-taking. The perception was, I don't want to be looked as I don't want to appear stupid because I chose the wrong answer. So sometimes it would
Mm-hmm.
leave these questions blank. And the point to drive home was, well, there's no loss if you get it wrong. So there's no penalty for guessing. So why not go ahead because you have a chance to get it? So we practiced this concept. We drilled it again and again. And we were coming up to the final practice test. And I asked Kenji, do you understand what to do? Kenji nodded. He said, yes. And I thought everything was going to go well. But as it turned out, Kenji left several questions blank. And keep in mind, this was after we had practiced and drilled this concept again and again. And this was the main focus of the lesson, was to choose an answer. And I just had no idea. I couldn't understand what was going on. Why, I said, Kenji, we practiced this. When in doubt, choose C. And you said you understood. Well, why didn't you ask any questions if you didn't? And he had no answer for me. I left the classroom. I was frustrated because I just didn't know what was going on. And I went into the teacher's lounge and I was venting to one of my colleagues about, what was going on with Kenji. And her response was, John, he's Japanese and you're his teacher. He wouldn't disrespect you by saying he didn't understand, because that would imply that your instructions were bad. And that's when it hit me. The meaning of yes to him was not, yes, I understand. It was, yes, I respect you, or yes, I'm listening to you.
Yeah.
And that was what really drove home that point for me, because the shared language is not necessarily the shared meaning. It all depends on two people, right? The sender of the message and the receiver.
And the interpretation. Your interpretation was he understood. His interpretation was, I hear you, I respect you, I will not say anything about my opinion on this. And in a similar vein, I remember when I was a nurse educator and somebody didn't understand the basics of diabetes. And I mean, this is on a medical floor, and you're expected to know this is one of the core problems people will come into to a medical floor and receive care. And she was not performing and understanding the basics. And it was kind of a situation where she didn't even understand when a person was going into diabetic shock. So these are things we want all of our nurses to have core competency in. And as a result of that, I was called in to provide remedial support for her to help her understand. And she would keep nodding and whatnot. And later on, when she would take the test to see that she had understood, she didn't do well. And then I began to realize, like you, her saying yes in her culture was, yes, I hear you. Not, yes, I understand, right? It's just, yes, I hear you. And that's a totally vast difference, right? So what you're saying is true. Just because we share the same language, it isn't a shared meaning. It isn't a shared meaning.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
What does that mean in terms of that significant impact for you in terms of helping others?
Well, what it comes down to for me, and what it comes down to what I teach for others is, okay, well, now we know that there is this difference in shared meaning. So what do we do about it? The initial instinct, I think, is to try and get others to conform to your own way of doing things, right? Initially. And this was something that we would talk about. Not just myself, but other teachers would say, well, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to do these things if you don't understand. It's not disrespectful. And I think there is a value in communicating that. Obviously, there is much that we can learn from each other. At the same time, ultimately, we only have control over ourselves and how we respond to situations. So doing that, I couldn't suddenly expect my students to suddenly shift, that they're going to all of a sudden start asking questions right away. It doesn't make sense, and it's a bit arrogant, I think, and not necessarily effective to assume that that's going to happen. So the other response is to adjust how you deal with the situation. And I realized in that situation, when I was working with students, that this was something that would occur again and again.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I should also mention that I hadn't mentioned specifically with Kenji was that after that particular incident that day, he never came back to any of my lessons. So that was the other, and that's something else I think that we also need to be careful of, because when we miss these things, when we make these cultural mistakes, a lot of times, fortunately, depending on the circumstances, if we understand our mistakes, we can repair them. But if we don't understand them and we don't make adjustments, we can lose employees over that, whether it's because they feel that they're not being heard, they don't belong, or what might even be more common, we make the decision, oh, this person's not a good fit,
Yeah.
when it was all just because of miscommunication. And so that, I think, drilled that home. So getting back to the point about what do we do about it, in terms of adjusting ourselves, I realized that I had to adjust my approach, because I still had to make sure that they understood what they needed to do, and I needed to confirm that. But I knew that asking, do you understand, was a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
What I did was I changed my questions. Rather than asking, do you understand, I asked, okay, could you please explain that back to me? Explain the instructions back to me. And that worked. That simple shift worked much better. And it wasn't just to check their understanding or their intelligence or anything. It was just to check, are my instructions landing? Is the way that I'm explaining them actually making sense?
Mm-hmm.
And when, depending on how they responded, then I realized, okay, well, I need to adjust. Perhaps I can show an example in some way, until I realize that they do, in fact, understand. And I'm playing the role that's expected as the teacher. I'm not forcing them to
Yes,
tell
yes. It's
me that
keeping that
I'm wrong.
open-ended question, right? Rather than make it subject to interpretation, you're allowing them to share whatever. And I know we're talking about cultural, but we're even talking about people who are born and this is the native language that they speak. So we'll use English as an example. Two people who grew up and they speak English fluently because that is their first language, they can misunderstand too. Right?
Absolutely.
So it's this
Absolutely.
whole, it's not just cultural, it is all the things that make us interpret things in different ways.
That's right. Yeah. Because we have so many different experiences. We talk about even people who share the same, technically, cultural, national background, can grow up in different environments, depending on their home environments, depending on, when we talk about culture, it's not necessarily just a country of origin or national culture. We talk
Mm-hmm.
about generational, we talk about
Yes.
socioeconomic, all the experiences that we've had, perhaps if we've lived somewhere else and also come back here. All of these things inform our identities and inform how we interpret things. So I can even think of the differences between my brother and myself, right? Even we grew up in the same household, and in some ways we interpret things very different. I think, those of us who have siblings probably encounter that as well.
I'll never forget, I read this book when I was much younger. It was called Hawaii, and they made a movie out of it. But if you read the whole book, there's a chapter where there's somebody who's Japanese. So he's born in the US. He goes to fight and he meets somebody in Japan and he ends up marrying her. But the marriage is strained because his cultural understanding of Japanese and the culture was based on his parents who left 20, 30 years before, had child, preserved the culture that they knew when they left, but they never moved along with the culture in Japan as it was continuing to evolve. So it's like, waking up 20 years later and you're still doing the same thing you did 20 years before. And she was modern. She was, a product of the 40s, and he was learning culture from the 20s or something like that. And that's when it dawned on me that it's not just the same culture. It's where you are in time. It's where the generations are. And the fact that the generations that came over were caught in that time bubble of what they remembered when they left. And then they hold on to it because that's what makes them feel good. That's what makes them feel comfortable.
That's an excellent example. And speaking specifically about that Japanese example of the Nikkei, those that's what they refer to those who are born elsewhere of later generations. My wife is of Japanese descent, but was born and raised in Argentina. And what you mentioned there, particularly, just even some of the language in terms of the vocabulary was used was different because of the textbooks that she had, and was using, for example, certain Japanese words that were considered outdated when she went to Japan.
Exactly.
Words where they would use more sort of loan words from English. They would have a Japanese word for, if you're talking about an area, the Japanese word would be something like, atari or hen, and she would use that. But then the Japanese that she was working with would say area, kind of the anglicized
Area. Or
version.
like computer.
Yeah, exactly.
I love the Japanese word for computer. Computer. So cute.
Right.
I was learning Japanese because we were going to Japan for the first time, and my older son and I decided we would learn and try to be a little bit of the mini ambassadors for Canada. But you're right, and I can use an example. When I was growing up, when people were kind of being stupid or whatever, we had a term for it called kuiso, which means he's silly. But then the Hong Kong wave came in the 70s, and they used the words G-scene, and G-scene means loose wires. And so here we were talking about the same when you're kind of being silly, that the vocabulary shifted, right? So again, these are reinforcements of when people come over, they may have a different vocabulary to the people that are in the community already. And so there's even a barrier amongst the same languages, cultures, because of the time frames. You talked in our conversations prior to this podcast about LEAP. And I gather this is your solution to helping us.
Yes. LEAP is a mind reset tool. I like to refer to it as, whenever you're encountering an unfamiliar situation or an unfamiliar interaction where the other person is reacting in a way that doesn't make sense to you in the moment or leads to judgment. So it can be applied, of course, they apply to cultural situations, but really it's any situation where the other person is not reacting. And it's a way of avoiding going into our gut reactions. Like I did with Kenji, was like, what's going on? Why is he being so, is he just, I'm making assumptions at the time that, oh, well, he's, he obviously he's just too embarrassed or something like that, or making those kind of judgments. And I like acronyms. So that's why I went with LEAP. LEAP has 4 steps: let go of assumptions, engage with curiosity, assess possibilities, perform with insight. The first and most important step, letting go of assumptions. Whenever you're encountering a situation that just feels strange to you, like I did with Kenji, why is it that, why didn't you say something? Rather than going to that gut reaction of assuming, whether it's assuming negative intent or just making any kind of assumption, take a moment and pause and think about, okay, well, what else could be going on here? What could be the other explanations? That alone is a valuable step, to just get yourself curious, which then leads into engaging with curiosity. Take some time to ask some open-ended questions in the moment, with the intent to learn as opposed to judging, as opposed to saying, well, why did you do that? Comes across as quite judgmental. Oh, well, it's interesting. What was your reason for doing that? Now, if the situation doesn't lend itself to asking questions the person directly, perhaps you can ask later, where you can consult with other sources, whether it's someone else you know who might be familiar with the culture. You could check on internet sources as well, obviously with the caveat of always being careful that sources are reliable. That's where assess possibilities comes in when you don't rely on one single source.
Mm-hmm.
Speak to the other person, find out what you can from other sources, because sometimes relying just on one source, well, we know the dangers of relying on a single source, even if it's the person you're asking directly, because what might apply to them might not necessarily apply to other people of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
culture as well. Right? Performing with insight is simply just taking those pieces of knowledge that you've picked up and applying them. So in the case for me, although I was applying leap late, rather than asking, do you understand? Adjusting the approach to say, can you explain it back to me? And performing with that. Because again, it's easy to take all of this knowledge and be interested in in cultural differences, but it's ultimately, what do you do with it? And that's why I have the perform with insight at the end there.
Beautiful, beautiful. And so do you teach this to people to help them really, have that right mindset to keep the dialogue open?
Absolutely. Because that's the most important thing, is just to stay curious. To me, the importance is a combination of curiosity and knowledge. It's also been termed as cultural humility when you have that combination. Because with knowledge is valuable, right? Knowing about cultural differences, whether you're studying, if you get into the academics and the history, talking about like Hofstede and the studies that were done in the 60s and comparing different cultures, and that's all quite valuable and a lot of foundational work. But if you only have knowledge, that can lead to stereotyping. Right?
Mm-hmm.
This
Mm-hmm.
person okay, so this person is of a Chinese background, so therefore that means that they're going to be this way. We have to, in terms of gift giving, things like that. They're not going to be direct communicators, for example, something like that. Right? And it's just another form. It's just a fancier form of stereotyping, really, with some
Yeah. Yeah.
academic backing to it. Curiosity is the more valuable term, but if you're just curious, well, I think it's better to be only curious than to only have knowledge. But if you have that curiosity backed with some knowledge, then that's the most potent thing, because you think, well, I'm curious, what could be going on here? This could be a possible explanation, but let's explore it. So, because then the knowledge helps to keep you maybe from going with a gut reaction. But that curiosity is what keeps you open. And leap is a way of keeping that curiosity open.
So
When you
here's
combine
the
it with it.
thing. There are people who can do it so naturally. They have a curiosity and they ask, and you feel like you want to tell them. But there's some people whose curiosity sounds like they're doing it to find out more about you, and you get suspicious. You know that feeling? So why do
Hmm.
you do that? Like, as opposed to, so tell me about that. There's a different way. One is more open, and you want to share to educate them. But then the way some people will say it, it almost makes you feel defensive. Or, why are you doing that? Are you trying to figure out if I got a lot of money and you want to rob me? Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
How, you've obviously come across this more than I have, probably. How do you help people who don't know how to show curiosity in an open way?
It comes down to any skill, it comes down to practice. The best way to do it is to practice with others and to emulate it as well.
Mm-hmm.
As a certified coach, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, a big part of coaching is being curious
Mm-hmm.
and asking questions so that people can come to their own conclusions. That helps me when I approach. There are sources out there, and we can find them on the internet, which uh, talk about uh, showing curiosity. But again, some of the sources do approach it in that way. that you've mentioned. Sort of, okay, tell me more about that. Where but it's done. What I think comes down to is what is the intent behind it, and I think the intent, which the person asking may not be fully aware on a conscious level, informs that tone. And sometimes that comes from the idea, okay, well, this is my intent is I want to get this particular goal. Okay,
Yes.
so I'm supposed to show curiosity. I think it also comes down to
Very
the idea
novice,
of,
that approach, right? Like they're very novice at the trying of
yeah,
it.
they're trying. And I think that's formative, but it's just, it's the same idea when we're learning anything. It's like, maybe a bit clumsy, right? And it may be because, okay, I've got the checklist, I'm supposed to do this, and it might feel a bit robotic. And I think that might be the case as well. Or perhaps someone who's, just not used to showing that curiosity because perhaps they've come from a background where you're supposed to be the person has all the answers. And I think that tends to be more common with men, in particular,
Yeah.
speaking as a man. It was only something until I really got into coaching that I got more aware of the importance of curiosity. That actually, that's a really valuable tool. And it's essential for working across cultures is with the intent of actually learning, as opposed to, okay, I have to have this checklist of, okay, now I'm supposed to ask them, okay, so why do you do that? Why do you do that? And just say, I'm curious. What are your reasons? And just sit back and give them the space.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Rev Up Your Leadership with Hilda Gann. Are you looking to build stronger teams, enhance communication, or lead with a people-first approach? I'd love to invite you to a free 30-minute discovery call to explore how we can help you with strategic HR consulting, leadership training, and team and communication effectiveness training. Visit peoplebrightconsulting.com to book your call. Now let's get back to the episode. When you're trying, maybe the first few times will feel awkward, but find the language that feels comfortable for you to say it without, saying it in a way that may be taken the wrong way. So practice, how can I say this that's in a more neutral tone, in a more opening tone, that language of curiosity. And like anything, think of it as a muscle. The more you use that muscle, the stronger it will be getting, and more natural and instinctive, rather than, it's just, I'm no good at this, so I'm not going to even try. Keep trying, because when you genuinely try, people can see that.
Exactly. And as you said, like any skill, it just requires that practice and getting comfortable with it.
I think
There
there
are
was
some
one other
people who are
thing.
natural.
I think there was one other thing we were going to talk about, and that was just being aware of your own cultural lens. So just expand on that for us, John.
It's essential if you're going to be able to work effectively across cultures. You have to be aware of your own lens. And we all have our own cultural lenses. I think in places like Europe, for example, where you have a number of countries and cultures together, in Asia as well too, where there's a lot of countries that are bordering each other. I think there's a greater sense of awareness of this, where okay, we all have our own cultural lenses. In places like Canada and the US, where geographically we're largely isolated, and yes, in places like Toronto, we do have mixtures of cultures. But for those of us who are perhaps sort of default, maybe for lack of a better word, vanilla Canadians, I don't know that we have an awareness, for many of us, I don't know that we have an awareness that we do have our own culture. I think you go to many Canadians, especially, multiple generational Canadians who don't necessarily express themselves as a hyphenated Canadian in some way. And you ask them, okay, well, what's Canadian culture? How can you explain that to me? You might get a response like, I don't know, or we don't really have a culture, or certain politicians in the past say we're a post-nation state and we're just a mixture of cultures. which to some extent is true. Obviously, Canada is shaped by immigration, and we have been mixed. But anyone who's worked here, particularly those who've come here from elsewhere, can tell you that, yes, we definitely have a culture, and it's invisible. It's the invisible culture, right? It's not so much in terms of festivals and things like that, but it informs who we see as a leader, who's considered leadership material, who's, and in Canadian context, that tends to be those who are sociable, who are comfortable networking, who ask questions of their leaders, or so on, are comfortable with eye contact. That's what we consider as people who are promotable or good leadership material. And in some other cultures, that would be the opposite, right? But we don't realize that that's a cultural thing. We assume that that's oftentimes it's very easy to assume it's a default. Why? Because we're not aware of that's a cultural lens. And the risk is if you don't have that awareness that, okay, this is a cultural thing and it's not necessarily a universal thing, then we learn about other cultures, then it's easy to kind of other them or exoticize them. Say, oh, okay, well, in this culture, in Japan, they do this and this, and it's and in China they do this, and in India they do this and that, and it's seen as, okay, well, it's even if it's benevolent, you might either say it's weird or oh wow, how interesting that is, but not realizing that, okay, well, that's one way of many things, right? Of doing things. In many South Asian and East Asian cultures, for example, hierarchy is more emphasized. So therefore, asking questions from someone who's lower in the hierarchy is maybe not so common and could be seen as like kind of a challenging thing and quite negative.
Yeah. I think the thing too is that we're all unique in our own way. So the stereotyping is, I'm sure people can't help that. But I find myself even, think of some people that are very traditional, very open-minded, and those that don't even want to follow traditions. So in any culture, you have that. So some places, they'll reverently follow whatever the celebration is, and they'll follow customs. And others don't even do things. My mother would always say, hey, it's Chinese New Year's, make sure you have chicken. And my brother would irreverently sort of say, okay, I'm going to have Kentucky Fried Chicken. Right. But in Japan, they celebrate Christmas Day by ordering Kentucky Fried Chicken. That was a great piece of marketing, and everybody pre-orders like weeks ahead of time. So, my point is that don't make assumptions. Each of us are unique in our own ways. So what may be customs for that culture, because of the changes of generations, the type of conservative versus open-mindedness, people may choose to not follow these customs. So stereotyping isn't there. They're naturally, for sure.
Absolutely, that's true. And at the same time, it's important for us to realize when culture may be influencing ourselves, because, and this is a point that I really wanted to make, I got an awareness of the general tendencies of Canadian culture. And again, we're talking in generalizations, but prototypes which do inform how workplace often works. I wasn't really, I knew them on an instinctual level, but I never thought about them as a cultural thing until I was in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was in a different environment where those things of, views on eye contact and so on were different. And again, there were individuals, just as encounter, as you mentioned, you encounter everywhere. But there are these, where someone might be considered kind of someone who asks questions in India, for example, could be seen as really rebellious and something. And here they're considered, oh, well, that's normal, right? And I've heard that also from people, coming from a culture where asking questions is considered negative, and they come here, it's like, oh, wow, now actually I feel really normal here, But you're right. We don't want to make assumptions
Yeah.
based on culture, but it's always important to know before you can start to really understand other people and other cultures, you need to be consciously aware of the influences on yourself. And, okay, how has my upbringing affected the way I see things, and realize that that's just one way, as opposed to assuming that that's sort of a universal default.
And I think it gets back to that concept that you have, and I like acronyms too, hence my rev up, that leap, have that curiosity, engage in curiosity, I think you said, and learn, continuously learn. I was, I think, in my early 30s. So what did I really know? And I'm Asian. I'm going to my international conference, which I got to speak at. It's in Hamilton because I had kids, so I could afford going to an international conference in Hamilton and only being gone for the afternoon. And so we're exchanging business cards, and there are people from all over the world. And this one person was Asian, Chinese, and she had her business card in Chinese and English. And I was used to, in those days, because there was no Google, etc., I was used to writing a little note for myself so that I could connect with the person. So here the Chinese woman from Hong Kong presents her card with reverence to me, which I knew it was reverence. What I didn't know was that this is her. This is her entity. And for me to write on her card, I was basically disrespectful. I did not know it then. She didn't tell me, but I certainly learned afterwards, oh my God, what did I do? So I am very, very respectful of people's cards, especially when they hand it to you with two hands and they bow. That means you need to follow up on this. Have some curiosity in this case. And I share that because, again, we have to have that curiosity. We have to learn. Well, we don't have to, but you should learn about different people so that you can show respect. And the R in Rev Up is treat people with respect, not the way you think they should, because this was your sign of respect, but learn how respectful means to them. And to that woman that I met in Hong Kong, respect would have meant not putting my notes on that card. So I share that example to help people think, how can we be aware of your cultural lens, but have that natural curiosity, right?
And the benefits of it when you can are exponential, because then you realize that it's something that's not just a nice to have to be respectful, and obviously that's a great thing to do. But then what you do is, when you are a manager or a leader who brings that in, when you're connecting with people, when you're connecting with colleagues, when you are leading your team, your multinational team, you get the benefits of diverse thinking. And that's the thing, is that it's not just a nice to have. It can give you a competitive advantage, because then those people will want to stay, they feel more respected, and you get that idea of people exchanging different experiences that boosts innovation a huge amount and can give you an advantage over your competitors.
And when you create that milieu where we get to know each other, and we learn to value and respect our ideas, our cultures, etc., it does create a healthier work culture. And that is what I call inclusivity in action. I don't like the idea that, we have these plans that sit on a shelf and they take forever to execute. We need to have practical things that people can do and create that healthy work culture. So thank you for introducing LEAP and sharing some ideas where it really is important for leaders to learn cultural fluency so that they can create that more healthier, inclusive workspace for people. Share with us, John, what's next for you?
What's next is getting out and spreading the message. One of the best ways that I can think of to spread the message is to speak. Getting out. I've done this past year, I've been focusing particularly on speaking. I actually competed recently at Speaker Slam, to spread an inspirational message. That story with Kenji, I actually shared that in the competition. And I have another event in mind related to speaking, but I'll just tease that for now because it's still in the works. But it's something that got in mind coming up for next year to kind of really bring that idea to the forefront. But I also have tools involved to check if you've got cultural gaps in your workplace, like sort of a cultural diagnostic tool, just a simple checklist, and that can highlight maybe those invisible gaps you may not be aware of and how they could be impacting your teams, impacting your business. So
So how do you want to share those tools with people? Like, how do people get a hold of you if they want to get your cultural tools, or they say, hey, that was refreshing, Hilda. We should get John to come and speak to our group or to that convention or whatever. How do people get a hold of you?
The best two ways to get a hold of me, LinkedIn, I'm extremely active on. So John Edward McGraw is my handle on LinkedIn. You can also reach me on my website, johnedwardmcgraw.com, and connect through me there. And for those of you who are watching, if you're specifically interested in that diagnostic tool, here's the URL that you can find for that. And if you are listening, simply reach out to me about getting a hold of your copy of that cultural diagnostic tool to see if there's a cultural gap in your workplace.
Great idea, because I think people sometimes say, well, so how are we doing? So thank you for creating that tool that people can have. So thank you, John, for coming on to rev up your leadership, and really appreciated the cultural lens with which we've had a discussion to help us be much more fluent and much more sensitive to creating healthier work cultures through understanding cultural nuances of people.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And to those of you who are listening or viewing our podcast, if you like this, give it a thumbs up. There are many more topics that you can hear, so don't miss another episode. Subscribe and check out the ones that have already been shared through our Rev Up Your Leadership podcast. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to Rev Up Your Leadership with Hilda Gann. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify to stay up to date with our latest episodes. For more leadership and HR tips and strategies, and to learn how you can create a people-centric workplace, visit our website at peoplebrightconsulting.com.